Once upon a time, long ago, in a kingdom of gleaming towers and endless gardens, there lived a king who was renowned for his vanity and greed. King Alaric was a man who measured his worth by the size of his treasury and the magnificence of his palace. He adored fine clothes, priceless jewels, and grand banquets that stretched long into the night. Yet, despite his wealth, he was never satisfied. "Nothing is perfect," he would often say, pacing through his gilded halls. "There must be something more, something eternal, something that will outlast everything else." His courtiers would nod and murmur their agreement, for they dared not displease him. But in their hearts, they pitied the king, for they knew he sought something no mortal could possess: immortality, perfection, and unending adoration. The discovery one spring morning, as King Alaric strolled through the palace gardens, he came upon a sight that took his breath away. Among the rows of vibrant tulips and towering oaks stood a single rose bush. From its branches bloomed a single rose, its petals impossibly red, as though they had been painted with the blood of the sunset. The flower seemed to shimmer faintly in the light, and its fragrance was so intoxicating that Alaric felt his head spin. "Magnificent," he murmured, reaching out to touch the rose. But as his fingers brushed its petals, a voice, soft and melodic, filled the air. "Do not touch me, mortal king." Alaric recoiled, his heart pounding. The voice seemed to emanate from the rose itself, and as he stared, he saw the flower quiver as if alive. "Who speaks?" Alaric demanded, his voice faltering. "I am the everlasting rose," the voice replied. "I was born of the earth's deepest sorrows and greatest joys. I do not wither, nor do I fade. I am eternal." Alaric's eyes gleamed with greed. "Then you shall belong to me," he declared. "I will build a grand glass dome to protect you, and you will be the jewel of my kingdom." The rose's voice turned cold. "I do not belong to anyone. If you wish to claim me, you must prove yourself worthy. My roots feed on purity and sacrifice, and only the most selfless acts will sustain me." But Alaric, blinded by his desire, heard only what he wanted to hear. "You will be mine," he said. With a swift motion, he ordered his gardeners to uproot the rosebush and replant it in the center of his grand palace. The glass dome, true to his word, Alaric built a magnificent glass dome to house the rose. The dome was adorned with gold filigree and encrusted with gemstones, ensuring that all who saw it would marvel at its beauty. The rose sat at the center, its petals glowing softly, its fragrance filling the air. The king reveled in the admiration of his courtiers and the envy of visiting dignitaries. "Behold," he would say, gesturing to the rose, "the crown jewel of my kingdom. It will never fade, never die. It is eternal, just like my reign." But as the days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen. The rose's demands at first, the changes were subtle. The air within the glass dome grew heavy, and the rose's glow dimmed. The king summoned his gardeners and demanded they tend to it, but no matter how much water or sunlight it received, the rose seemed to wither. Desperate, Alaric returned to the garden where the rosebush had first grown. To his shock, he found it littered with small bones, bird bones, rabbit bones, and even human bones. The sight chilled him, but his greed overpowered his fear. He returned to the palace and knelt before the rose. "What do you want?" he asked. The rose's voice whispered, soft and venomous. "My roots feed on purity and sacrifice. Without them, I will wither. You took me from the earth that nurtured me. Now you must provide what I need." Alaric hesitated, but the thought of losing the rose, the one thing in his life that was truly eternal, filled him with dread. "What must I do?" "Your heart," the rose replied. "Give me your heart, and I will thrive." A bargain struck. Terrified at the thought of his own death, Alaric refused to give his heart. Instead, he ordered his guards to bring him prisoners from the dungeons, offering them to the rose. But no matter how many sacrifices he made, the rose remained unsatisfied. You cannot trick me, Alaric, the rose said. Your heart is bound to mine. Until you give me what I ask, my roots will grow deeper into your soul. And so it began. Alaric felt a strange heaviness in his chest, as though invisible vines were coiling around his heart. Each night, he dreamed of the rose, its petals brighter and more beautiful than ever, but its thorns piercing his skin, drawing his blood. The king's decline as the months passed. The once proud king grew gaunt and hollow. His hair turned gray, his eyes sunken and rimmed with dark shadows. The courtiers whispered of a curse, but none dared confront him. The rose, meanwhile, grew more radiant, its petals shimmering with an otherworldly light. One night, as Alaric sat alone in the glass dome, he heard the rose speak again. Its voice was softer now, almost kind. You cannot escape me, Alaric, it said. But I will give you one final choice. Sacrifice yourself, and I will bring life and prosperity to your kingdom. Or cling to your life, and watch your kingdom crumble as I wither. Tears streamed down Alaric's face. He thought of the choices he had made, the lives he had taken, and the emptiness that his greed had brought him. For the first time, he understood the cost of his ambition. I will give you what you ask, he whispered. The final sacrifice the next morning, the kingdom awoke to find the glass dome shattered. The rose bush had vanished, and in its place lay King Alaric, lifeless, but with a peaceful expression on his face. His heart had been pierced by a single thorn, and from his chest grew a new rose, as red and radiant as the first. A kingdom transformed in the years that followed. The kingdom flourished. The land became fertile, the people prosperous, and the memory of King Alaric faded into legend. But in the palace garden, a single rose bush grew, its blossoms eternal, its roots deep. The people who passed it often felt a strange warmth, as though the rose carried the spirit of the king who had finally understood the meaning of sacrifice.